thank you to Slow Factory for hosting this and for having this incredible program, this open education program. I also want to thank Celine in particular, but also Jungwon Kim, who invited me to give a class today. I also need to thank Nicole for organizing this event, Krista for making these beautiful slides, and Antonio and Jenny for interpreting and being here with us today. Obviously, I need to thank all of you for joining us on this Friday. It's beautiful in Brooklyn right now, and I really could not be happier to be here. So thank you for that. So today's class is Racism and the Fashion Supply Chain. We're gonna begin by talking about fashion racism, but really figuring out what it is and you know, later on what to do about it. So when we talk about fashion racism, typically discussions of fashion racism, whether in the news media, in social media, and oftentimes in academic spaces, focus on visible and often spectacular examples of fashion racism, like a racist fashion photograph, or photo spread. Here we go, some examples here. A racist fashion window display, racist screeds by a fashion designer, that's on the left there, or sometimes the lack or absence of models of color on a runway or in a magazine. And of course, racist runway shows and racist fashions, right? So these kinds of spectacles, these spectacular forms or events of racism is the ways in which we usually think about fashion racism, right? And obviously, I'm sure everybody on this Zoom right now could add to this list. The list goes on and on and on. These examples represent the most visible, the most overt forms of fashion racism. What I want to suggest today is that focusing on the visible, the spectacular, and so the most surface level forms of fashion racism doesn't just make for an incomplete understanding of what fashion racism is, it misunderstands the deeper structural conditions, operations, and functions of fashion racism and racism's role in capitalism more broadly. Focusing on fashion's most overt forms of racism, which are, again, often outrageous and shocking, constructs fashion racism as an anomaly, as if this racist spectacle marks some kind of a break from the routine ways that global fashion and capitalism ordinarily function. Focusing on fashion's most overt forms of racism means that we're also not focusing on the ways in which racism is not a problem or an external problem that afflicts fashion, right? So the idea is that if it's this external problem that afflicts fashion, then once we fix it, that problem is solved, right? And so the focus on fashion's outrageously overt racist spectacles misdefines and misunderstands racism as a problem. And when racism is understood as a problem or a glitch that upsets the ordinary functioning of global capitalism, and here global fashion capitalism in particular, a few things happen. We get fixated on the problem of the racist spectacle, limiting the solutions that we can imagine. That's to say, our critical imaginations are limited to fixing this problem. This is why the fix is almost always another spectacle, right? So, if we imagine a problem in a particular way, then the solution to that problem is often matching the ways in which we're imagining this problem. So oftentimes, a spectacle of racial exclusion, for example, right, is reversed, replaced, or canceled out with another spectacle, this time a spectacle of racial inclusion. So, the solution to a racist fashion spread is a diversity spread, an all Black or all Asian spread or magazine issue. So that spectacular racism begets spectacular diversity or spectacular inclusion. Another example of this, consider a magazine editor who's been called out for some act of racism. The magazine fixes this problem by issuing a highly publicized press release, another spectacle, in which they promise any one of a number of diversity initiatives, right? And these include hiring more non-white fashion writers, editors, and models, or publishing more feature stories with multicultural themes. These kinds of spectacles of racial inclusion are now standard tools in the arsenal of corporate diversity practices. They're public-facing fixes that operate in the arena of the visible. Good spectacles are designed to replace the bad spectacles. Spectacular forms of racial inclusion are also contingent on the goodwill and conscience of the fashion brand. We rely on, and really, we hope that brands want to offer some kind of apology or apologetic action. But corporations don't have a conscience. They have corporate interests. And as I've explained elsewhere, corporate diversity solutions serve corporate interests. Corporate diversity initiatives aren't political, much less moral positions. I've listed just a couple of articles that I've written that are focused specifically on corporate diversity and fashion, if anyone's interested in those. The larger problem with focusing on and fixing the spectacular, outrageous forms of fashion racism is they don't get at the underlying entrenched structural realities of fashion's unequal power relationships. Corporate diversity solutions, more often than not, manage to contain a public relations problem. And because of this, they're temporary. They fade when the public outrage dies. When the public outrage dies down and the concern doesn't reappear again until another racist spectacle emerges. And we know that another spectacle will emerge, another racist spectacle will emerge, right? So these spectacles of inclusion, right, are just band-aids that cover over rather than deal with the deeper problems, the deeper structural problems. These spectacles don't get at the underlying entrenched and structural realities of fashion's unequal power relations. Corporate diversity solutions manage and contain a public relations problem. And because of this, they're temporary. So spectacular racism, as well as spectacular diversity or inclusion, ignore all the ways that fashion racism functions invisibly in the everyday, ordinary, and mundane processes that constitute the business of global fashion. In fact, the public-facing solutions to fashion racism, the spectacles of racial inclusion, often work to divert attention away from the deeper structure of racism that underpins and drives global fashion capitalism. Ironically and strategically, the solutions to fashion racism often serve to cover over or to provide an alibi for fashion structural racism, which will continue on no matter who is on the runway, on the cover of a magazine, or at the top of a fashion magazine's masthead. So rather than focus on fashion's spectacular racism, I want to shift our attention to the ways that racism is a mundane and ordinary part of global fashion. What I'm suggesting is that racism isn't a glitch in fashion, but is in fact the very operating system on which global fashion runs. So I'm going to repeat that. Racism isn't a glitch in fashion. It's the very operating system on which global fashion runs, and by which I mean global capitalism. Racism organizes the structure and determines the function and the power dynamics of the fashion supply chain. As we'll see, racism shapes the internal logic of global fashion. Now, this isn't to say that fashion racism doesn't sometimes emerge in spectacular, outrageous, and appalling ways. Of course it does. We've seen examples of that. But fashion's spectacular racism is only the tip of a very large iceberg. Whether or not there's a racist spectacle in the news, racism is always operating as an ordinary, mundane, and often invisible feature of the global fashion system. So what do I mean by mundane racism? There are many ways in which racism is entrenched in the ordinary operations of global fashion. But today my focus is going to be on these forms of fashion's mundane racism that you see on the screen here. We often hear that racism is structural. This is particularly true when we're talking about global fashion. Racism has been part of fashion since its globalization, right? Racism became institutionalized in global fashion at the moment that fashion production went global. Okay, so a little bit of a history lesson here. In the late 1970s and then accelerating in the 1980s and 1990s, trade liberalization policies lifted the barriers that had restricted much of manufacturing, that kept much of manufacturing within national borders. So these policies, which were aided by neoliberal discourses that put forth the idea that free market capitalism was a necessary condition of free societies, right? Allowed, but also encouraged, and I'm going to talk about the ways in which these policies encouraged Western brands to move their production offshore to poorer countries where labor costs were cheaper and labor conditions were harder to monitor and regulate. So again, beginning in the late 1970s and then accelerating to the 1980s and 1990s, globalization policies created conditions that made it possible for Western companies to offshore their production, a strategy designed to help them maximize their profits by minimizing their production costs. It was at this time in the early stage of globalization that the center of apparel manufacturing moved from the US and Europe to the global South in designated export processing zones, or EPZs, where factories are given exemptions from most labor laws, health and safety regulations, taxes, and trade duties. And in this period, so we're talking about the 1970s and 1980s, EPZs were mostly established in Mexico, Central America, Asia, Micronesia, and Haiti, all non-white countries. So by the early 1980s, we can already see the beginning of what is still the current global division of fashion labor, where high value, high prestige design labor is centered in and reserved for the global North, particularly the US and Europe. And low value, low prestige production labor is pushed onto the global South. This global division of fashion labor isn't an accident, right? It's not an accident that much of apparel manufacturing is done in poorer countries, and often countries that are non-white countries, right? This global division of fashion labor was created by racist design, by the racist design of globalization policies. International trade and labor policies, policies that facilitate globalization and global fashion, are the very definition of racism. Sociologists have defined racism in this way: as any structure, practice, or process, really anything, that functions to organize and distribute resources, value, and power along racial lines in ways that maintain and secure the dominant racial order. So here it is on the screen. Globalization policies that create a system in which low-value work and its many harms and dangers get shifted to Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa, while high-value work and its many privileges and rewards are reserved in and for US and Europe, is by definition racist. Whether these policies use overtly racial language or not, and most oftentimes they didn't use racial language. They mostly use language that seems, again on its surface, race neutral. Words like free market, free trade, and so on. International trade and labor policies offered Western corporations regulatory and economic incentives, like the export processing zones, to move their production, right, outside of the US, outside of Europe. But they also encouraged Western corporations with race and gender-based incentives. So in blunt terms, countries in the global South weren't just attractive sites for apparel manufacturing because they were seen as cheap sources of abundant and unregulated labor. They were also attractive locations because the available labor force was represented in racially gendered and sexualized terms as docile and easily controllable. Local and foreign governments represented poor women of color as naturally suited for the demanding and quote unquote unskilled work of apparel production by emphasizing their nimble fingers and their compliant dispositions. In the words of an investment brochure circulating in 1980 and sent to Western brands, this is just a quote from this brochure: "The manual dexterity of the Oriental female is famous the world over. Her hands are small and she works fast with extreme care. Who, therefore, could better be qualified by nature and inheritance to contribute to the efficiency of a bench assembly production line than the Oriental girl?" The racialized, gendered, and sexualized association of apparel manufacturing with non-Western women and women of color, and here Asian women in particular, provided a cultural rationale for slashing work conditions, worker protections, and wages. This racist and sexist view of non-Western women of color as not needing or deserving living wages, full-time and permanent employment, and other labor protections explains why export processing zones were established where they were, and why today women and girls of color in and of the global South continue to be the largest demographic group in the global garment sector, right? It's because it's in their nature, right? Garment workers in the global South, women in the global South, it's in their nature to serve efficiently. Today, Asian women and girls from China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Pakistan, Myanmar, and Cambodia produce 60% of the world's clothes. Racialized sexism and colonialism, then, aren't external problems that afflict the fashion system. They actually create the very conditions that make the global industry possible. No diversity initiative, which is so often little more than a public relations strategy, can change the structural reality. More often not, I mentioned this before, they obscure and gloss over this reality in which women and girls of color are disproportionately and routinely subject to dangerous work environments, physical, sexual, and verbal abuse, and legally permitted exploitation in the forms of minimum wages that are poverty wages, the piece rate pay system, and other kinds of wage and severance wage theft. Racially gendered violence isn't outrageous in fashion. It's mundane, routine, and ordinary, and it's institutionalized and normalized in international trade and labor laws that underpin the creation and operation of EPZs. It's also institutionalized in other ways. Now, I won't be able to have a full discussion of all of these ways that racism is institutionalized in fashion, but I did want to name them. Oops, where did that go? I'm missing a slide, I'm sorry. Okay, so let me name them. There's the bad contracts between international brands and garment factories, the convoluted and opaque supply chains that's designed to allow brands to evade their responsibilities by hiding behind layers upon layers upon layers of subcontracting arrangements. And as I just mentioned, the structures of legalized exploitation, like the piece rate pay system, and a minimum wage standard that doesn't amount to a living wage. So these are all the ways, and certainly we can name other ways in which racism is institutionalized, right, is entrenched, is baked into the global industry. But in the time that I have left, I want to take a closer look at the contracts between international brands and garment factories. And as we do, keep in mind the definition of structural racism I mentioned before. So structural racism, the definition of structural racism, right, is any structure, practice, or process that functions to organize and distribute resources, value, and power along racial lines in ways that maintain and secure the dominant racial order. In the early days of COVID, we learned that brands were systematically canceling their orders. The media and public viewed these cancellations as examples of brands behaving badly, of brands acting outside the range of normative corporate conduct. But the right to withhold payment, in fact, brands' unilateral right to amend any part of the contract at any time, is enshrined in standard contracts between Global North brands and Global South suppliers. And these entitlements are protected by international trade and labor governing bodies that exist to serve and protect corporations. In other words, these contracts and the international trade and labor organizations that sanction them are racist, right? Refer again back to the definition of racism that I'm using here. They function to extract resources and power, human, environmental, and economic resources and power from the global South, from workers who are overwhelmingly women and girls of color, to upwardly redistribute these resources and power to brands that are largely in the global North. To get a sense of the sharply asymmetrical power relationship that exists between global North corporations and global South workers, I turn to a study by the Worker Rights Consortium that was published in September 2020. So in the study, they examined one of Kohls' contracts. Kohls is the largest department store in the United States. In its contract, in Kohls' contract with its garment factories, Kohls gives itself the right to cancel purchase orders. And this is a quote, in whole or in part, without supplier authorization and at Kohls' sole and absolute discretion. So again, Kohls gives itself the right to cancel in whole or in part, without supplier authorization and at Kohls' sole and absolute discretion. And in March and April 2020, the early months of COVID, at least in the United States, Kohls did just that. It canceled, or more accurately, refused to pay for $150 million worth of orders to its suppliers in Korea and Bangladesh. So that was March and April 2020. In June 2020, after just saying that COVID made it impossible for Kohls to pay its Asian suppliers, it paid $109 million in dividends to its US stockholders. Now, Kohls isn't unique. It's important that we don't exceptionalize these stories as a problem, right? Or individualize these stories as a problem that's isolated to Kohls or isolated to even budget brands. Remember that this kind of structural racism is routine, mundane, and ordinary. It structures the organization and functioning of global fashion supply chains and contractually constitutes the relationship between fashion corporations and its suppliers. Consider Arcadia's contract. Arcadia owns stores like Topshop and Topman, among other brands. Arcadia's contract explicitly stipulates that, quote, the cost of the goods, the cost of any fabric, or any other cost at all, including the cost of labor, is the supplier's responsibility once orders are canceled. Going on, it states that if we suspend or cancel an order, we will not be legally responsible for any direct or indirect damage or loss this may cause you. These contractual causes may be surprising to you. They certainly were to me. But I know many of you have heard of a contractual provision known as force majeure. Beginning in the early COVID months, again, brands invoked force majeure, a legal doctrine that excuses the parties from their contractual obligations due to impediments beyond their control or major forces. So this is a common feature in all sorts of contracts. This isn't unique to fashion contracts at all. But contracts between fashion brands and their many subcontractors and their subcontractors, all the way down to the garment factory floor, are distinctly vague and uniquely one-sided. These contracts provide brands with the exclusive right to invoke force majeure. Typically, the one-sided terms of the contract would give suppliers grounds for legal action. But the same contracts also provide brands protections against these actions in several ways. So for example, brands insulate themselves in these contracts by requiring, and this is another quote, legal action to be filed in the courts of the country where the brand is headquartered, right? So a factory in Bangladesh or Myanmar would have to file legal action in the US or in Italy or wherever that brand is headquartered, not the supplier's country. And these contracts require that the supplier pay the brand's attorney's fees if it loses. Together, international trade and labor policies, the contracts between brands and suppliers, as well as fashion's long and convoluted subcontracting system, and the legal norms that classify brands as buyers rather than employers of garment workers, a classification that releases brands' liability to their suppliers, constitute a system of structural racism designed to benefit global North brands and consumers. And it's important that we also implicate consumers here, right? That the system is designed to benefit global North brands and consumers at the expense of poor women and girls of color, their families, and their communities. Today, the amount of that expense is in the billions of dollars. Now, I just mentioned the subcontracting system. I assume that many people on this call know what that is. And also this issue of the classification of brands as buyers rather than employers. I'm not going to get into it too much today, but I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A if anybody has questions about that. But this system of structural racism, right, which benefits global North corporations, consumers at the expense of global South, and particularly women and girls of color in and of the global South, right, has a cost, right? And today that cost is more than in the billions. Recently, the Clean Clothes campaign estimated that 1.6 million garment workers in just 7 countries, Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Pakistan, are now owed nearly $12 billion in wages. This is the study if anybody's interested in it. So again, these are just 7 countries. This study looked at 7 countries, all of them in Asia, but these 7 countries are important because they make the bulk of the world's clothes. They produce most of the world's clothes. So I think that what I want to do here, so that we have time for Q&A, is that I want to start concluding this, but I want to end with a couple of provocations. First, that fashion's racism is not only mundane, ordinary, and often invisible, but also that fashion's racism is particularly anti-Asian in ways that are also rendered mundane, ordinary, and invisible. And so what I mean by that is that when we talk about racism, when we talk about fashion's racism, we need to start pushing for more specific terms, right? Because the dynamics of anti-Asian racism in the global supply chain is very specific and has a history. And I was also very curious when, a few months ago, when the Stop Asian Hate hashtag was going viral all over social media. And certainly, that hashtag also affected fashion. So again, what we saw is that I saw that hashtag, the Stop Asian Hate hashtag, being applied to anti-Asian racist spectacles in fashion, right? But one of the things that I didn't see, and one of the things that I kept waiting for, is for a conversation to happen around the ways in which even the placement of export processing zones, the ways in which Asian women and girls are making the majority of the world's clothes, which is to say that they are disproportionately made vulnerable to the harms and dangers of the global fashion supply chain. That in itself, that kind of harm, right, it embodies fashion's racism, right? And it wasn't just the spectacles of kind of Orientalist design, for example, or the racist messages that a designer might have about Asians, but that anti-Asian racism, in fact, that the global fashion supply chain embodies and enacts racism, but particularly an anti-Asian racism. So I want to put that out there as something for us to think about. Second, my second provocation is that any solution for fixing fashion racism has to go beyond lifting up an individual designer of color or a model of color. And also it has to go beyond calling out an individual brand or an individual market sector, fast fashion, for example. We need to expand our critical imaginations beyond an individualist response. Solutions have to be structural, which means they have to prioritize the collective, the collaborative, and the relational. To do this, they have to be internationalist, and they have to account not only for the public-facing labor markets at the top of the supply chain, fashion modeling, fashion media, fashion design. But also, we have to prioritize the invisibilized labor markets at the bottom of the supply chain. And that includes the garment industry, but also includes farmers and other people that provide the source material for fashion. I think that where I'm going to end is by just saying that there's no anti-racist fashion analysis or solution that doesn't centralize garment workers and those at the bottom of the supply chain. Thank you very much.
Let's take this opportunity to, answer these questions and, just elaborate on some of the things that you shared with us. One of them, let's begin, before I even take a look at the Q&A, I just want you to know that behind the scenes, we have been, just going crazy in our Slack, being like, wow, 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 amazing. One of the things that we love the most, not one, but there's so many, but one of them is how you define mundane racism. And mundane and just mundane racism and racist design were two things we put aside as a word, as a compound of words we would like to define, as like definition cards, of course, with you as the author. But before we go there and create that, how would you define it? Mundane racism and racist design. Just elaborate a little bit more on that, because that was very good.
Yeah. So let me start with mundane racism. Obviously I'm opposing mundane racism. I'm contrasting mundane racism to spectacular racism, right? So the spectacular forms of fashion racism in particular here are those that, that shock us, those that are public, that are splashy, and that disturb us in some way, right? But in that kind of shocking, in characterizing racism as shocking and disturbing, then what we do is we misunderstand, we misdefine racism in fashion and certainly in capitalism, right? Because fashion is a kind of an exemplary system of capitalism. In defining racism or looking for fashion's racism in the spectacular, then what we miss is all of the ways in which racism just kind of churns along every day in really boring ways in policies, in contracts, right? And so in some ways, policies and contracts and international trade laws are really boring. They're mundane, right? But it's there. And in some ways, in the kind of banality, in the boringness of these sites, contracts, laws, policies, racism is allowed to kind of keep operating without notice and without critique, right? Because that's not where we're looking for it, right? And it operates, it's invisibilized, it's institutionalized, it's baked into, as they say, the system of fashion. And what I said earlier about the racist design is that international trade and labor policies that encouraged, that pushed, that offered incentives, economic incentives, but also racial and gender incentives for Western corporations to offshore their production, right? The reason that we see so much apparel manufacturing being done in what we know of as the global South is not an accident. It is by racist design, right? So that the idea, and that was the slide I showed you about the brochure kind of encouraging, brands to move the production particularly to Asia, because the idea was that these workers were somehow naturally suited for this kind of exploitation, right? And certainly their work is unskilled because they have these small hands that somehow are naturally suited for this work. And so these policies, that the structural reality of the global industry today, the global fashion industry, today is not an accident, but actually constituted by the racist design of these laws, the asymmetrical contracts, and so on.
Yeah, I just wrote in the chat. Can you tell us a little bit more about the nature of your work? Because I'm sure a lot of people might be interested, and then I'll dive into the Q&A.
Yes. The nature of my work in relation to human rights. Yeah, I think I'm going to start by just saying that one of the things that I hope that we can push towards, right, in when we're talking about, because I think that a lot of us want more ethical fashion, right? And I think and ethical fashion has become very popular, right? But one of the things that I want to kind of caution us around is that our imagination for what ethical fashion looks like, I think, has to expand, right? And so, an example is, I don't think that it's enough. Like, it's a first step. I don't think that it's enough to push for example, to push for minimum wages for garment workers, right? Because we know internationally, including in the US, minimum wages are not living wages, right? And so one of the things that I want us to think about is the ways in which ethical fashion has to go beyond the bare minimum, right? So it's the minimum wage. I want garment workers to have a living wage. I want them to have enough to have the time to spend with their family, to have free time to spend with their family, have enough to enjoy the kinds of extracurricular activities that we were just talking about. Taking their kids to soccer practices, that kind of thing, which requires resources like time, money, health, etc. And so, my work is really thinking about how to reimagine and how to critique what we mean by ethical fashion. And oftentimes, our ethical fashion solutions are actually not ethical, and we can spend all day on that. But the kind of easy solution of, like, where I see boycott this, boycott that brand, doesn't ever, often doesn't take into account how that kind of boycott might put extra pressure on a garment factory or on garment workers writ large, right? And so, the idea for me is always listen to garment workers, listen to labor organizers on the ground. Don't assume in Brooklyn, in California, et cetera, that what you're doing is ethical. Make sure that we're taking account of the entire supply chain, so that it's not just what looks good at the top of the supply chain in magazines on the runway, but also that whatever is, that we begin at the root of this, right? The foundations of the industry. And that's where garment workers are. They're the foundation of the industry.
Absolutely. Everything you're saying, I'm just nodding. I think we can talk long and large together about the unethical, ethical solutions that are being popularized, right? Let's dive a little bit deeper into the Q&A before we go there. One question was, who established EPZ? Do you know what they're talking about?
Who established EPZs? Yeah. International trade and labor governing bodies. So we can think of the World Trade Organization, right? Established EPZs. But this is going to go a little deeper than we probably have time for today. But the World Trade Organization, the World Intellectual Property Organization, these international governing bodies were created from the lobbying efforts of Western corporations. Right. And that's important to understand. When we think of international trade organizations, what we often think of is that these are kind of organizations that are looking out for, different countries and different entities equally. That's not true. They were created through the lobbying efforts, particularly of pharmaceutical industries, pharmaceutical corporations, so Pfizer, right? And so because of that history, what that tells us is that their interests and who they imagine they're there to serve is very specific. Again, this is, why EPZs are where they are, and why they allowed EPZs to be exempt from all of these protections.
I'm just writing in the chat, how about a thriving wage? Is that too much to ask?
I hope not. I hope not.
Exactly. There were a lot of questions regarding, wow, how can we imagine better systems? Because that is the goal here of the OpenEDU, is that I think there's poverty is a double-edged sword, where it forces us to really expect the least and demand the least and demand the bare minimum. Already the bare minimum is looked at as abundance, as, look, you had nothing before. And that is part of the the paradigm of racism and oppression the West keeps on the people of the global South, this idea that you were nothing, you were not even able to feed yourselves, and look, now we are giving you the minimum. So it's true that we are constantly unable to imagine what is a thriving wage or what is a better life for our people, because the global North will basically give us these paradigms of extreme poverty, or just minimum, basic. Don't be too happy, don't be too comfortable, don't be too, don't expand your mind, don't, etc. So there were a lot of questions about, okay, so, this one in particular, with what we know, are there ways to actually get reparations? How do we imagine a better path forward? It's a big question.
Yeah, and it's important to say here that sweatshop abolition, which I've written about also, that sweatshop abolition is happening. These aren't pie in the sky ideas, right? This isn't something that we don't have to reinvent the wheel in some ways, right? So there's many organizations, and I've written about a couple, and I'll just, shout them out today. In Los Angeles, the Garment Workers Center, right? In Chicago, but I think maybe now also maybe in San Francisco too, Blue Tin Productions, right, are examples of worker cooperatives where workers are getting together to decide their wages, getting together to decide whether they're even going to take a job, getting together to decide the terms of their contracts, right? And what's important here is that what we're seeing is that to actually fix fashion racism, we have to dismantle the system. We can't just make it slightly better or more tolerable or more palatable by having, maybe more people of color on the runway. More people of color on the runway doesn't actually change the fact that 1.6 million garment workers are waiting on and will likely not receive $12 billion in wages, right? That's not going to matter, right? Who's on the runway, who's on a magazine cover. And so we have to, when we think about how to make the system better, we actually have to think about not improving it, but actually dismantling it, right? Before this class, I was thinking about, imagining the kinds of reformist reforms, the ways in which ethical fashion reforms often work by kind of putting beautiful wallpaper, right, on a termite infested wall. That doesn't work. You have to dismantle it and start again, right? And garment workers are doing that work now. Garment workers and organizers are doing that work, imagining a more beautiful, a more abundant way of not just being a worker, but of living. And that becomes important. The other thing that I want to say that I'm seeing that brings me so much joy and hope is that Sarah Ziff, who is the founder of Model Alliance in New York, Sarah Ziff and Marissa Nuncio, who is the director of the Garment Workers Center in Los Angeles, are in conversation. And I've been lucky enough to be part of these conversations. But one of the things we have to do in dismantling the system is that we have to stop thinking about these labor sectors, modeling, design, garment industry, as separate and siloed off sectors or nodes of the garment, the supply chain, right? And so obviously the work conditions of a fashion model are different than the work conditions of a garment worker. And the racial dynamics are also different, right? But the ways in which gendered violence, gender-based violence shapes both of those sectors, right? Is something that they can organize around. And so we have to, again, if we think about like, how do we get more models of color on the runway, for example, then that conversation has to also include, because in the garment industry, diversity isn't a problem. The garment industry is like almost all women of color, right? And so if we're just looking for, increasing people of color in the garment industry or in the fashion industry, in global fashion, in fact, global fashion is highly diverse. So diversity isn't the answer, right?
Yeah, no, the diversity is not the answer. It's the power dynamic, the power
That's right.
structure, the hierarchy of structure. So when you were saying these roles should not be siloed, they are siloed and hierarchicized because that's how they maintain this pyramid of of power. For instance, even the models may be the ones that are the most paid, but they have the least power at the end of the day as well. And maybe they portray diversity, but at the end of the day, they have zero decision power within this organization. So yeah, it's not the diversity and inclusion, it's redistribution of power, redistribution of funds, and as you were saying.
That's right.
Okay, it's 1 p.m. Let's wait. We can go up to 1:15, up to you if you have time. Do you have time, Minh-Ha?
I have a little bit more time, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Hello, would it be possible to discuss how Made in Italy branding plays into fashion racism, but in a way that is usually hidden behind a global North country? I think a lot of people assume that all Italian-made fashion is ethical and made by well-paid workers. False. But a lot of Italian workers in secret sweatshops. So it's exploitation of the global South happening right here in the global North. Also, the racist positioning. There's a continuation because she had no more room. Martina Tam, thank you so much. Made in Italy as superior because of the implication it's made by implied white Italians versus Asian workers who are assumed to make inferior, cheap products. Thank you. Go ahead. Go crazy. Go on.
Oh my goodness. Yes. So made in Italy, much like made in the US, much like, doesn't guarantee good working conditions. It doesn't guarantee it at all. The other thing that we know about fashion is that fashion has now across labor sectors, so we can talk about this with fashion modeling as well. But the garment industry has historically relied on migrant labor. Right? So they're intra-national migrants. They're also international migrants. And why is that? This is a question that I pose to my students in class. I teach a class on fashion labor. Why is that? Because oftentimes factories are counting on, and the brands that hire them are counting on migrants and immigrants to not know the labor rights that they have wherever they're at, right? And there are other ways in which they make garment workers vulnerable. Sometimes they take away their passports and hold them until they, make a certain amount of money. They're relying on the fact that they don't know the language of where where they've moved to, that they don't have communities, that they don't have their families because they've moved away to make money, right? And so oftentimes, whether it's in England, whether it's in Italy, whether it's in the US, this garment, your clothes are being made by women of color, women and girls of color, right? The majority of garment workers are women and girls of color. It does not matter if it's in California, in New York, in Italy, whatever. We also know that brands are taking advantage of, the kind of the racist understandings that consumers have about made in the US, made in Italy, made in France, right? By moving factories to Italy, moving to their factories to Italy's, moving Chinese factories to Italy's, or to the US or whatever. And so that oftentimes the factories in Italy are Chinese factories, right? And then I also, in addition to that, I also want to say that, it's so ridiculous to think that because something is made in China, in Thailand, in Myanmar, in Cambodia, and Vietnam, that it's going to be shoddy. The truth is that because of the history of global fashion, these countries have had a lot of experience and have created a very experienced labor force that are doing this work are doing this work quickly, but also with the most craftsmanship, right? So and there was years ago, Lucia Prada actually said, right, I'm going to continue making my stuff in China because that's where the best stuff is made. Like the garment workers there are experienced and seasoned precisely because of globalization. And so globalization, you mentioned a double-edged sword. There's the kind of cruel irony in that this level of exploitation, which now, again, has been going on since the 70s, that is now it's created this labor force that is extremely skilled, extremely fast, but yet still being devalued and be devalued by brands, but also devalued by consumers who think made in China is, a sign that it was made in a sweatshop, as if sweatshops don't exist in Italy, in the US, et cetera. And that it's, a knockoff product, right?
Oh, yeah, totally. And the racism of made somewhere else than the global north is poor quality. That is something that I hear and heard at TED as well, continue to hear in all white groups in the global north, conglomerates of this authority on sustainability. And I don't know if you know, but in 2018, I wrote a piece about that, about, colonialism in the supply chain and colonialism in the fashion industry and how it continues to be an economic reality, which was funny. I know I'm talking a lot about TED because I just came back yesterday night. But at TED Countdown, basically all the solutions were around the economy. If you want to fix climate, you have to fix the economy. But it wasn't around equity. It was around just redirecting funds towards renewable energies and clean tech and data and all of those things that that the global north really loves and colonialism thrives on, which is basically this sterilization of sustainability. It's this automation of sustainability, when sustainability, if we want to talk about it, is about human rights first and foremost. And that was completely missed in the conversation.
And human flourishing and human
flourishing, not just the rights, human
beauty. And yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for adding that. Sorry, I was.
No, I know that's what you meant. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. We have one more question. It's 111. EST, make a wish, everybody. As we inch towards our ideal world where fashion and craft, this is from Yuhei Ogawa, as we inch towards our ideal world where fashion and craft work become more and more localized, anti-globalization, how could we continue to offer equal access to goods to the public for those who don't have the means to travel or to pay for higher shipping costs? How do you visualize it?
Okay, so I don't know if I'm going to be answering this question, but the question raises some issues that I want to put on the table for
Absolutely.
sure. We need to be very careful, and this is again one of those, where ethical fashion solutions may not be ethical. We need to be very careful about the local fashion movement. We need to be very careful about that, because what I've seen is that the discourse around local fashion, right? Very often bleeds into a discourse that is very nativist sounding, right? And again, as if the local is good, and then that leaves the foreign to be bad, right? So the foreign is bad, the local is good. I live in Brooklyn. There are garment factories. There are garment workers. There's a garment industry in Brooklyn. It's emerging. It's in Sunset, and you can make a local product again, right? You can make a global product, a global garment. A local garment, and it may still not be ethical, right? That garment workers may not be making living wages. Oftentimes, they're not making living wages. So even though
because Sunset Park is where they relocated the garment district.
That's right. That's
So
right.
at the end of the day, I visited parts of it because we were looking into it, and I was literally shocked by how it was being made. Like made
That's
in New
right.
York is not necessarily made in a positive way.
No, and we've seen this local discourse before, right? Made in the USA in the 1980s when it came to car manufacturing. Made in the USA also invited all sorts of anti-racist, particularly anti-Japanese sentiments, right? And we actually see this in fashion today. It doesn't get talked about very much, but the kind of the consumerist pull towards local fashion is also producing this kind of particularly anti-Asian, anti-Chinese sentiments about made in China, right?
Yeah.
So in a lot of ways, consumers are taking part in this trade war that the U.S. is in with China, and so we have to be very careful about that. At the same time, when goods are being shipped internationally or even across the country, because the U.S. is such a large country, that we do have to think about things like where buying secondhand on eBay, but from a seller that is far away is going to be a problem. Or renting clothes is a problem when they have to be shipped to you, right, and then possibly shipped back.
And the dry cleaning industry that is also uh, mainly, the same. There are similar issues between the dry cleaning industry in New York and the garment workers in New York City.
Okay, I don't know that. I'd love to hear more about
Yes,
that.
yes. I mean, of course, some of them are independent, but yeah, we can talk about that. This should be a whole other class, by the way.
But this is exactly what I mean, like, about the relational, right? We have to think about these things in relation to each other and not just siloed sectors.
Absolutely. Yeah. Any last words you would like to share with us?
I'm so thrilled to have been invited, and I hope I get invited again, Celine.
Of course. I wish for us to do another class, definitely.
Absolutely. This was amazing. I appreciate everyone. I'm really looking forward to reading the chat. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh my God, Minh-Ha, thank you so much for giving this wonderful class. Thank you, Antonio, for capturing our emotion. Thank you so much, Nicole and Jenny, Nick, Jenny, and Antonio for the accessibility. Of course, thank you so much, Nicole, for capturing everything, and as well as Alan and Paloma. Thank you, Krista, for designing these classes, and John Juan for suggesting you. I was also a fan of yours, and as soon as she mentioned, I was like, yes. Feel free to pitch us more classes as you have ideas. Of course, we're trying our best to think of curriculum, but we are very grateful for any suggestions and pitches that we receive. The chat is beautiful. It's on fire. Take 5 minutes and however long you want to take a look at it. We will save it, of course. Janwan is here listening in as she's on her way from Edinburgh to London after the TED conference that I mentioned was very white. And just thank you so much for your framing on mundane racism, on racist design. I think we're going to just be in touch with you to recap your session properly, and would love to have another session with you, Minh-Ha. Thank you.